Halito, and welcome to Native Chalk Talk, a podcast by natives for all. Here we're keeping our Native ancestors' stories and history alive while also sharing with you our Native cultures, traditions, and more. I'm Rachel Youngman, a Choctaw originally from Anadarko, Oklahoma. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me as we learn from our Native American guests. And stay tuned for the end of each episode where we'll talk about some great ways to support Native causes and or Native-owned businesses. Let's get started. But first, a word from our sponsor.
Potential is everywhere in the Choctaw people. It's in our schools and students. It's in our small businesses and entrepreneurs. Potential is in our lifestyle and health. It's in our culture and heritage. Passion and commitment is in our blood. Ingenuity and economy are a tradition. And the Choctaw Foundation was founded for this potential. To cultivate minds and hearts, to stimulate ideas and passions, to extend lives and improve health through education, and to preserve and promote the power of our past. The Choctaw Foundation, meeting the potential of the Choctaw people.
My guest today is Wayne Johnson out of Kansas City, Kansas. And I've been so inspired by his words and the good work that he has done in education for our Native American kids. He served our country in the Navy and has an impressive resume in the world of Native education. Halito, Wayne, thank you so much for your service and thank you for joining me.
Histongo, Mado. I'm glad to be here.
Wonderful. Thanks for taking time out. And what our guests probably didn't see is we just spent like 2 hours with some technical issues, but Wayne has been so patient. And as much as I admired you already, Wayne, I think your cool factor just went up even more. So, all right. So you hail from the Muscogee tribe, correct?
Yes, I do. And I'm Muscogee and Seminole. My dad was half Seminole, so I'm 1/4 Seminole and 3/4 Muscogee.
All right. Well, welcome. For our listeners, the Muscogee were originally from Alabama, Georgia, Florida, and Tennessee. And of course, most of them were forced in the 1830s to move to Indian Territory, now Oklahoma, and what is now known as the Trail of Tears, or as we actually call it, the removal. But before we learn more about your ancestry and your good work in education for our Native youth, tell us a bit about your early life and where you grew up.
Yes, I was born actually in Wichita, Kansas, and I guess the history of that was that both my mother and father lived in Oklahoma in the Indian Territory of the Muscogee Reservation, and then of course after they got to a point in their life where they were looking for a place to settle down, once they got to meeting each other, they ended up in Wichita. So that's kind of how I grew up in Wichita. Although I'm very partial to Oklahoma, my dad would come home from work and he'd say, "Pack up, we're going home." That was Oklahoma for us. So Oklahoma is kind of, in my heart, always been home. It's also where I went to high school, Wichita High School South, and it's also where I joined the Navy, like my dad, like my brother. So I always considered myself being a veteran and understanding the privilege that many of our people, have experienced being warriors. It's always an honor for me to talk about me being and having served.
That's wonderful. And thank you again for your time and service to our country. And so you went to Wichita High School, as you mentioned, and then into the Navy after that. And you were encouraged then to go to Haskell Indian Junior College, but you initially didn't want to go. Why is that?
I have to back up and share a little story with you that when I was in high school, it was my senior year, and I think the counselors were calling a lot of the seniors into the office just to, visit, talk about what maybe their future might hold. And at that time, being an educator myself, at that time, students were not privy to what was in their counseling folders. Anybody could put anything in those folders, and the parents couldn't see them, nor could the student. And so I was sitting there at the desk, and the counselor, she got up and left the room. Well, she left the folder laying open, and nosy me, I kind of looked over the front of the desk, and I saw that she had written in the column of the folder, not college material.
Oh my God.
And, and at the time, I guess I didn't think much about that because I guess I didn't really consider myself college material either.
Hmm.
My grades weren't all that great, and nor was my ACT. And quite frankly, I didn't really care about going on to college. So I graduated, and of course, as we know, the Vietnam War was real big at that time. And so I already knew that here I was graduating in May. I was going to turn 18 in October. And by December, I was joining the United States Navy. So that was in the latter portion of 1964. So that's why we might think of it as a tough time, but yet at the same time, I was because my dad was in the service, my older brother was in the service. I wanted to be in the service, so that was the next 4 years of my life.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, like, you think about someone putting not college material in somebody's folder. I mean, what counselor of the
Yeah.
year right there? What is that?
Let me follow that up. I spent 4 years in the service, and I got out, and Rachel, all of a sudden you find yourself thinking, okay, you kind of remember what life was like before those 4 years, and now all of a sudden it's an entirely different world. It's a whole different circumstance than what it was before, you left home. So I've always been kind of athletic, and so that summer that I got home, after I got home, I started to play fast pitch softball with a bunch of other Indian guys around town. And little did I know that the catcher on our team was the head basketball coach at Butler County Junior College, which is in El Dorado, Kansas, just north of Wichita. And after the game, he knew that my brother and I had just gotten out of the service. So after the game, he came up and spoke about Haskell. Well, I did not know that Haskell was becoming a junior college, and he was going to be the head basketball coach. And he
Wow.
said, "We'd really like to have you and your brother come and go on to school. It's not going to cost you anything." And and as funny as it might seem, I recalled that day sitting in the counselor's office, looking at that little script there that said "not college material,"
Oh my
and
heavens.
so it created a little bit of panic. You know, I told the coach, no, I just didn't think that I could do college work, and so I said no. And he
Hmm.
also spoke to my brother that same evening, and my brother said no. Now, what I did not know was that he had spoke to my mom and dad. And when we got home, they called us upstairs and sat us down, and that's what they wanted us to do: quit school, quit our work, and go to Haskell.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of funny, amusingly, afterwards, I told my brother, I said, now, is that the same dad that told us after we graduated from high school that we're going to live at home, you're going to work, you're going to pay a bill, and you're going to help buy food. but
Wow. What happened in there? That's crazy, right?
but that's what we did, because only because of our mother and father, we quit our jobs and we went to Haskell. And
Wow.
I can tell you without going through my entire life at Haskell that it was one of the most wonderful experiences that I have ever had.
That's
So
amazing.
so when I sent you that picture and I told you that that was the beginning and the end, my AA degree from Haskell, it's the only degree I have posted on my wall other than my doctor's degree. So for me, I see that and I'm reminded of what my mom and dad gave me. You know, we did that and changed our life and gave us something to look forward to. Now, my brother did go on and get a master's degree at Penn State.
It's great.
So he left Haskell, went to Fort Hays State. I left Haskell and went to Baker University. And then that's kind of how my life started, I guess, after the service. But I feel very blessed about, about having been able to go to Haskell. I know Haskell as an Indian school has meant so much to a lot of people. And I can tell you, as I traveled across this country for the business of Indian education, you're always going to run into somebody that went to Haskell. One of my good friends is Billy Mills, the Olympic champion. And he's a Haskell alumni. But, like I say, it's always a pleasure to sometimes travel around and run into people that you maybe even went to school at Haskell.
Yeah.
Um, in my business of education, I knew if wherever I went, whatever meeting I was attending or whatever I was doing, I knew I was always going to run into either a friend that I went to school with or just somebody that attended Haskell.
Wow. It really is interesting too, Wayne, that the short of the story is for that is, you overcame so much with just that one mention from a counselor in your file. You overcame that. You had the confidence to overcome that hurdle that counselor had put in your way. You knocked that down, you ran over it, you never looked back. And you basically turned that around to be such a great thing for you and your family and your kids later and all of that. And I love that your passion is for education and it didn't come easy to you. You worked for it, you worked hard for it, and really showed that counselor what Wayne Johnson is all about, right?
Really, I guess I do still think about that a little bit and kind of laugh, but I was in the business of American Indian education for 40 years before I retired, and that single comment that counselor made had a lot to do with how I dealt with young people that I worked with
Mm-hmm.
when I was at Flanders Indian School, when I was at Pine Ridge, when I was at Todd County on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation, when I was at Riverside Indian School in Oklahoma. All of those opportunities that I had to work with young people, both on reservation and off reservation, that's something that I always wanted them to feel
Mm-hmm.
uh, that was they could do whatever they wanted to do, not because somebody didn't believe in them.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So we, I know a little bit about what it's like to work in a public school, but my 40 years was working with American Indian people in American Indian communities, either
Mm-hmm.
on or off reservation. So, and I'm proud of that. I like to think that if I left any legacy at all in what I did, it was to have the opportunity to work with Native young people, the Pine Ridge, where the Pine Ridge School is, and where the Todd County schools that I worked with on the Rosebud Sioux Reservation are considered two of the poorest counties in the nation. But I can tell you, well, it might have been the toughest place to work, but they were two of the greatest experiences for me personally to be there and live there and be a part of, these young people's lives. And somebody driving through there might not think that it's such a great place. But I can tell you the experiences that I had there, and I just value and cherish those so much, even now, mostly because a lot of the Facebook friends that I have are my former kids, and they always keep in touch with me, and it's always so cool to see the things that they themselves have achieved, after they graduated from high school, nurses, educators, just professional people, because they took a position to say, I can do this. And, and I'd like to think that was a little bit of my influence in working with them. But it's always fun to watch and see, how well they do. And so yeah, you're right. It's been a total blessing for me to have had that experience and turned it into something real positive.
Well, and I hope that, when you were working with kids, sometimes you would tell them that story, or even your own kids or whatever, because it's a great inspirational piece. I know I'm going to use it to inspire me. Hey, tell me I can't do something. Go ahead. I'm ready.
Exactly. Exactly.
So let's see. So you were in the Navy, you came home, you did Haskell Indian School, played fast pitch softball, which is awesome. And then after that, is that when you went to Riverside Indian School?
That's a whole nother thing about me going to Flanders Indian School. I was at Baker University. I was in the student union over at Haskell, and the president of the school came in. He saw me sitting there, and he said, Wayne, you're going to graduate this year, aren't you, from Baker? And I said, yes, sir, with my bachelor's degree. And he said, have you thought about what you're going to do? And actually, I had given it a lot of thought because I always wanted to be a football coach,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually had maybe two or three other opportunities to do that, to go and coach somewhere.
Cool.
At the same time, he had a friend that was a superintendent at Flanders Indian School in South Dakota. He said, come over to my office. So we went over there, and he called Flanders, South Dakota. And they knew I wanted to coach, and they didn't have any PE positions, which I was a physical educator, but they had an English teacher, and my certifications on my teacher's certificate showed that I was, certified to teach English.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't want to teach English, and I wanted to coach. So I told him no. So that last semester, I was doing my student teaching, and I got a call, and it was from South Dakota, and they wanted me to reconsider, coming there. And so now all of a sudden, that kind of threw a monkey wrench into things, because, was I going to take these other opportunities to go on to school and coach, or was I going to take this job? And history would have it that I would take the job. So, and Rachel, I look back sometimes, not with any disdain for anything, but that was a real crossroads for me to say
In
that,
what way?
well, to say that I wasn't going to do what I wanted to do to coach. And all
Right.
of a sudden, I was going to be a teacher. I mean,
Yeah.
teachers do coach, and I
Yeah.
did, and I did that. But it's not like I wanted to be a college coach.
Mm.
So, and I had several opportunities to do that, and I made the decision to take a job. So that's really how I ended up at Flanders Indian School, was because of the president of Haskell at that time. And then I stayed there for 2.5 years as a teacher. And then I moved to Oklahoma because once again I got a call I got a call from two superintendents, one at Chilocco Indian School and one at Riverside. And they wanted me to come work there. Now, I had to choose between Riverside and Chilocco.
Hmm.
And the way I did that was the first school that did the paperwork first. That's where I went, and that happened to be Riverside in Anadarko. So that's how I
Hmm.
ended up there. But I stayed 2.5 years at Riverside, and I actually only stayed 2.5 years at Riverside. And of course, I played a lot of fast pitch softball in Oklahoma, and I still played fast pitch softball for high school. And all the while, I worked on my master's degree at Weatherford Southwestern those 2.5 years. Now, this is crazy because I graduated in the summer of 1980 with my master's degree. I'm standing around in the office at Riverside Indian School, and the secretary says, "You have a phone call." And when I answered the call, it was a good friend of mine at Pine Ridge, South Dakota. And he said, "Wayne, we're looking for a coach." And I said, "I don't coach anymore. I want to be a school administrator." And he said, "Then we're looking for a principal." And so I applied for the principal's job. And before school started at Riverside that September, I was headed to Pine Ridge, South Dakota, and as the principal of the high school. So for the early part of my career since I left Haskell, 2.5 years at Flanger, 2.5 years at Riverside, getting my master's degree, and now becoming a principal at Pine Ridge.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. And let's see, during that time before you went to Pine Ridge, were you working with my dad at the same time at Riverside Indian School?
I
I wasn't
was,
sure if you were,
yes.
okay. How crazy is that?
Yeah,
I keep running
yeah,
into those scenarios and it's awesome.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that is so cool because, and again, Rachel, I have to tell you, in the positions that I worked in and the places that I have been, half of my experience has been just the people that I worked around. That was half the job, just associating with the people that you worked with and working with the kids. And, it really created, I have to say, a real community environment with
mhm.
all of the people that you were around. That's what Haskell was to me. That's why I was successful at Haskell. That's why I could do the work because
Mhm.
you were around people that you enjoyed being around. You enjoyed being at the school, doing the things that you did that made you want to do your best there. And
Yeah.
you always had the support system to do that. And again, like I say, I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. But just being around Indian people in general, that's the way it was everywhere I went. Family, Riverside, Pine Ridge, and then I stayed a year at Pine Ridge, and then I took the principal's job at Flanders Indian School in
Mhm.
Flanders. That's where I started. So I kind of went full circle. Started at Flanders as a teacher, ended up the principal.
A lot of folks have heard of Pine Ridge due to controversial and devastating events over the years. Home to the Oglala Lakota tribe, which is a subculture of the Sioux people, Pine Ridge is located in South Dakota and at over 2 million acres or 3,400 square miles. It's considered among the largest of reservations in the country. It is also considered one of the poorest. Today, there are approximately 28,000 Oglala Lakota in the reservation. Bear with me here, listeners, as this story is so intertwined among multiple important and devastating events. There once was a native religious movement called the Ghost Dance of 1890, which various tribes believed would bring dead spirits and living people together again in hopes of pushing back the white settlers encroaching on their lands and also bringing unity to multiple tribes. There was a spiritual leader named Jack Wilson, otherwise known as Wavoka, who prophesied that this unity would actually happen. This religious dance that spread throughout the United Western States from California to Oklahoma really took off. It's such an interesting concept since at the time, tribes were rarely joining together, whether physically or spiritually, for a common purpose. At that same time, the Dawes Act had been enacted in 1887, so some believed that the ghost dance spurred the Lakota to resist the Dawes Act. For those who aren't familiar, the Dawes Act is significant for our Native ancestors. That act divided Native land holdings into land allotments for the heads of each household. So, for instance, that's the moment that my ancestors and many others received 160 acres of land in certain tribal territories. Some American Indians did fight this act. Each Native was given a roll number, and many didn't like the idea of being turned into a number. And my own great grandfather scalped and murdered multiple people during this time for that very reason. So again, the ghost dance was blamed for what was about to happen next. Fearing that the ghost dances were meant to rile up the natives to wage war against the government because of the Dawes Act, the U.S. decided to put a stop to the movement. Sitting Bull was to be arrested, but he was killed in the process. So Chief Spotted Elk, who was leading some sects of the Sioux and the Lakota, he fled to Standing Rock Agency seeking sanctuary at Pine Ridge. On December 29th, 1890, the 7th Cavalry attacked and killed over 150 Sioux, half of them being women and children. This was known as the Wounded Knee Massacre. In the Lakota accounts of the massacre at Wounded Knee, from the report of the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for 1891, was an account by American Horse, which read, "The men were separated, as has already been said, from the women, and they were surrounded by the soldiers. Then came next the village of the Indians, and that was entirely surrounded by the soldiers also. When the firing began, of course, the people who were standing immediately around the young man who fired the first shot were killed right together. And then they turned their guns, Hotchkill guns, etc., upon the women who were in the lodges standing there under a flag of truce. And of course, as soon as they were fired upon, they fled, the men fleeing in one direction and the women running in two different directions, so that there were three general directions in which they took flight. There was a woman with an infant in her arms who was killed as she almost touched the flag of truce. And the women and children, of course, were strewn all along the circular village until they were dispatched. Right near the flag of truce, a mother was shot down with her infant. The child, not knowing that its mother was dead, was still nursing, and that especially was a very sad sight. The women, as they were fleeing with their babies, were killed together, shot right through, and the women who were very heavy with child were also killed. All the Indians fled in these three directions, and after most of all of them had been killed, a cry was made that all those who were not killed or wounded should come forth and they would be safe. Little boys who were not wounded came out of their place of refuge, and as soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. Listeners, if you haven't read the book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, please do so. Fair warning, though, it will break you. It will absolutely break you. Growing up in Anadarko, Oklahoma, I grew up with a lot of Caddo, and during the Indian Exposition every year, the ghost dancers would come down Main Street during the fair that kicked off the exposition, and my sisters and I were always in awe. Another event of significance in 1971, Oglala Lakota College was created in Pine Ridge by the Sioux. A grassroots protest started in 1973 due to discontent within the reservation surrounding the push to impeach the Oglala Lakota tribal chairman, Richard Wilson. Now, Mr. Wilson was apparently unpopular with some of the tribal members. He favored mixed races over full blood and the traditional ways, so half of the tribe was not pleased. So they called on AIM, the American Indian Movement, for support. The tribe divided into two camps that had armed themselves, and activists from all over the camp came to occupy the area in support of the protests. What is known as the Wounded Knee Incident was a result of this event, which turned into 71 days of a standoff with law enforcement, including the tribal police as well. 2 natives and 2 law enforcement officers were killed and many injured as well. AIM and their protesters agreed to cease the occupation and protest after the White House promised to look into their complaints. Now, talk about awkward. After the occupation had ended, Richard Wilson wasn't removed as chairman because it actually would have been illegal for the U.S. government to remove him. So he and the tribal protesters, which was only a portion of the tribe, of course, but they were at odds to say the least. And not only was he not removed, he was reelected and eventually became tribal president in 1974. Can you imagine what tribal gatherings must have been like when he was present? So 3 years after the protests, Pine Ridge had the highest murder rate in the country. I mentioned AIM, or the American Indian Movement, earlier. The most well-known female activist in AIM was Anna Mae Aquash. On February 24th, 1976, her body was found in Pine Ridge Reservation. She had been shot execution style. Interestingly enough, some people from AIM said she was an informant for the FBI, which has been denied by the government. It wouldn't have been too much of a stretch, as the head of security, Doug Durham, was found in 1974 to have been an FBI informant. It turns out Anna Mae was killed by 2 members of AIM. Sometimes it's not easy to hear certain pieces of history or facts about what's going on in the Native American communities, even today, but it's important that we all learn. Here are some statistics according to the Friends of Pine Ridge Reservation.org. Pine Ridge Reservation is the poorest county in the United States. Rapid City, South Dakota is the nearest town for those who can travel to find work. It is located 120 miles from the reservation. The nearest large city to Pine Ridge is Denver, Colorado, located some 350 miles away. 97% of the population lives far below the U.S. federal poverty line, with a median household income ranging between $2,600 and $3,500 per year. There is no industry, technology, or commercial infrastructure to provide employment for its residents, contributing to its 90% unemployment rate. There are no banks, motels, discount stores, and the one grocery store of moderate size is tasked with providing for the entire community. There's a 70% high school dropout rate. The average life expectancy on the reservation is 47 years for men and 52 years for women. Teenage suicide rate is 150% higher than the U.S. national average. Infant mortality rate is the highest on this continent and about 300% higher than the U.S. national average. There's an estimated average of 17 people living in each family home, a home that may only have 2 to 3 rooms. Some reservation families are forced to sleep on dirt floors. Over 33% of homes have no electricity or basic water and sewage systems, forcing many to carry often contaminated water from local rivers daily for their personal needs. At least 60% of homes on the reservation need to be demolished and replaced due to infestation of potentially fatal black mold. However, there are no insurance or government programs to assist families in replacing their homes. Weather is extreme on the reservation. Severe winds are always a factor. Summer temperatures reach well over 110 degrees, and winters bring bitter cold and can reach 50 degrees below zero or worse. Many of us know the situation in Pine Ridge, but it doesn't have to be a situation that we ignore. I encourage everyone to check out friendsofpineridgereservation.org, where you can contribute to current donation drives and so on. So please, everyone go check it out, and if nothing else, share the information on your social sites. I'll also be sure to post the link for Friends of Pine Ridge on my Native Chalk Talk Facebook page. So Wayne, did you experience some of that when you were there, that extreme weather and, some of those really devastating statistics there?
Yes, I did. And I think while the numbers are maybe a little bit different in many of the places that I've been, I think you could probably find the same problems exist with all of the Indian tribes, not just Lakota or the Sicangu, but, because there's reservations all over South Dakota, up into North Dakota, and many of them deal with the same circumstances, same situations. And I think, being an educator, the really cool thing was that in sports, we played each other. We would go to their place or they would come to Pine Ridge. A lot of the white schools didn't like coming to Pine Ridge, or even when I was at Todd County, sometimes they didn't like coming there. But it was okay for our school and our fans to travel, to their communities. But again, this is what I had said earlier, that being an educational leader in some of these communities It wasn't my responsibility to make judgment, about,
Of course.
all that happened, all that, took place. But yeah, the weather was always a factor in the winter. They're harsh, more harsh on people who have no ability to heat their homes, more often than not, as hard as, say, the Oglalas tried to provide wood for stoves and things. It was just hard to stay warm in that kind of condition.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as the schools, when I got to Pine Ridge that year, it was one of the older schools. The auditorium really was not functional. The roof was falling in. We did not use it. It was still attached to the school, but we had to keep people out of that area. I remember one of the cultural classes that we taught used the foyer of the auditorium as a classroom because you couldn't go in the auditorium.
Hmm.
And the second time I went to Pine Ridge, they had a nice new high school. But, it's things that, like any of us, people live with. You know, they, I won't say they necessarily learn to live with it. It's it's a place where, as much as we would not want to have to rely on the federal government, but in many instances, that's the case. That's always what the federal government wants and wanted, was for Indians to be dependent upon them and not use their sovereignty to achieve a better life for their people. And the book that I'm currently reading, that's what that is about, how the Bureau of Indian Affairs has dealt with Indian people all these years and violation of treaties, taking their land, killing their ability to create any kind of development programs to generate funding to assist their people. The book, by the way, is called Our Brother's Keeper, Indian in White America. It's a good book. You might want to pick it up. I think those circumstances and me having the opportunity to work in them, I think has helped me to be, who I am. I think there's always a need to define who each of us are as an Indian person. And I have to tell you that when I look at combining all of the experiences that I've had growing up in the home that I grew up in, having the mom and dad that I had, working in all the places that I worked, being in all the communities that I've been in, it has strengthened, I guess, what I call Indianness. So it's helped me to focus a lot more of what I read into real life. The time that I was at Pine Ridge was a little bit after, the Wounded Knee thing and everything had happened, and things were kind of settling back in, to some normalcy.
Mm-hmm.
They had a different tribal president now, and so my good friend that we worked at the school with, we were always riding around the res,
Right.
and he said, and I asked him about. I said, what's Dick Wilson do now? And
No way.
so he says, you ever been out to his place? I said, no. He said, I'll take you out there. So we went out there, and he actually owned an auto salvage car place. I think he maybe did some mechanic work. And that's how times change. Dick Wilson goes from this, president of the tribe and, being a part of all that occurred. And now he's just back to being a regular Lakota,
Right.
running running an auto salvage. So
Wow, isn't that interesting? And
it's
so some of those stories that I told you were from not Wounded Knee, of course, but some of those other ones you may have been familiar with,
yeah,
right?
yeah. As you were reading, I'm very familiar with. I of course I have read "Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee"
Oh, right.
and several other books, about just American Indians in general. But even I have read about the five civilized tribes.
Mhm.
But I think that's the thing, especially my experience, being all the places that I've been, my association with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And, so much of my life has been a part of the government and BIA politics, in Indian education. And that alone is a whole different story, that I could tell about my experiences dealing with, the federal government. But not only federal government, but state government as well. Like, for example, when I was at Todd County is actually a public school on an Indian reservation. And
Mhm.
so we dealt with state politics as well as federal. So, Indian education, there's a lot of, one of the schools on the Pine Ridge, one of the schools on the Rosebud, like, for example, Red Cloud Indian School is a Jesuit school on Pine
Mm.
Ridge. And
Mhm.
St. Francis is also a Jesuit school on the Rosebud. And as you'll recall, history will tell you that the religious sects were used to assimilate Indian people. The federal government paid religious people, like the Catholics, to go in and help assimilate American Indians. And as you can see, what happened in Canada is part of that problem. Finding
Mhm.
all those kids buried at those school locations, and those were all Catholic
So sad.
schools.
Yep. And the Catholic schools were actually truly historically the ones that were, let's say, a lot harder on the children. And, we're not here to sugarcoat the truth. It's the truth that has been coming out for many, many years from accounts from people who were in the boarding schools. And now, proof of a lot of that, especially with the mass graves of buried Native children. So, and again, it's nothing against the Catholics or the Christians or any particular faith, but there were bad people at one time who, this was abuse. And if we don't talk about it, they always say history is doomed to repeat itself, right? If we don't at least
Yeah,
acknowledge it. So,
of course.
but that also, having said that, the disclaimer here is you worked at Riverside, you worked at Pine Ridge and Rosebud and Flandreau, and as well as my family did that there's a huge difference between those boarding schools of that time and the boarding schools of today, which are wonderful opportunities now where kids go on their own. They're not forced to go there. Either their parents want them to go or the kids want to go because maybe they just want to learn more about their culture, about their language, be around other Native kids, or maybe sometimes in some cases, it's a better scenario than what they had at home. They get 3 square meals a day and a nice roof over their head. And I don't want people to get the wrong impression of today versus yesterday.
No, I think there is obviously there's a big distinction between the boarding schools of today, and at the same time, when we speak historically about those situations, boarding schools were not something that tribes necessarily wanted, because you're right, they did take the children, and how the current day boarding school has transitioned into what we think they are. There's still a little bit of tough thinking about, if they don't go to boarding school, what kinds of schools on the reservation exist where they could stay home? Well, and 9 times out of 10, there isn't any, so they go off reservation to public schools. And
Mm-hmm.
and so it's not always an easy circumstance, but
Sure.
you're right. They do have the option of going to a boarding school, and many of our kids choose to do that. But for the longest time, to implement federal policy to fund boarding schools doesn't really, fit well with the kind of education that I think, our tribes would like for our kids to have. But because some of the current federal laws that exist, like Chapter 1, sometimes Title 1, depending on how the law is written, a lot of these laws were intended for schools on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, back when they were created, a lot of the kids were leaving the reservation to go to school. So the funding somehow had to get to the public schools to help in their education.
Mm-hmm.
That's why in a lot of public schools you see, Chapter 1 programs, or sometimes, well, like our tribe, and I know the Choctaw tribe too. They get funding to help with the public schools that their kids go to,
Mm-hmm.
and the Creek Nation, Muscogee Nation does too, because that was a department that I oversaw when I worked with the tribe. And the federal government always had their hands in everything that affected Indian people, and certainly education is one of them. When I first moved from Flandreau to Oklahoma, and you may recall, not long after I got to Riverside, they closed Chilocco Indian School. They closed Fort Sill. So the federal government had little regard for any kind of treaty that would have said, we'll take your land, but we will provide education.
Mm-hmm.
But here you go, here the federal government doing, whatever they wanted to do. Fortunately for Sequoia, among the Cherokee Nation, the Cherokees contracted Sequoia. So the Cherokees run Sequoia. But as we know, Fort Sill closed, Chilocco closed, and they came very close to closing Concho.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow Riverside survived before they stopped that political onslaught to close boarding schools. And
Mm-hmm.
so, again, the government doesn't choose to respect the sovereignty of the tribes and consult and work with, to provide and address the needs are of Indian people. So part of my experience all those years in education, working at these different schools, both on and off reservation, was how well I understood the motives of the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And because you hear the term "we're still here."
Mm-hmm.
Well, that term comes from the federal government's Indian problem. The only way to solve that problem was to exterminate them all. And while maybe that doesn't persist as much, they still provide little help to maintain the survival of Indian people.
Mm-hmm.
Tribes are having to do that themselves. So, and some struggle with that, and it's still hard for a lot of tribes and a lot of people. So, and education was one of those. And so when we talk about what my life has been, that's what it was for my mom and dad. And so the federal government, and my mother was right. The children back in those days were wards, and that's the way they viewed it, wards of the government. That
Mm-hmm.
the government could do whatever they wanted to do with little or no regard or respect to the families. And a lot of policies were based on whether tribes had schools and their kids were in the schools. A lot of harsh reality with all of that.
Absolutely. And your own mom and dad met while they were at Chilocco Indian School, correct?
Yeah, when I think back, and when my wife's opportunity to speak to my mom about her mother passing away when she was 8. I think it was, she said in 1930, the girls were taken to Eufaula boarding school in Eufaula, Oklahoma, and her brothers were sent to Uchee boarding school at Sapulpa. And so the point being is that they were removed from their homes. Little or no respect, again, as I indicated, for the families or for the parents. They just took them. And if I could, I'd like to share a statement that from an interview with my mom that Bernita interviewed my
Please
mother
do.
at one point. And knowing what I know now, this statement is so powerful. This was her life. And sometimes
Mhm.
all we can do now is read about it in books. And this is what it says, and I speak verbatim from my mother. Mama passed away in 1930. When she passed away, they took us out of our home to a boarding school. I never realized it then, but after I grew up, they had always said that as children we were a ward of the government. We were Indians, and so that we had no choice. Dad had no choice. They came in and took us away. I just, my knowledge, this is the way that it was for, all Indian kids, all Indian families. This is the way the government treated Native people.
What's that like to hear that in your mom's own words?
You don't want me crying again.
Oh, I better be
And,
sending you some tissues if that happens. No, I
yeah.
get it. It's that's
No, I think for me, that I've always been blessed. I feel very fortunate that through all the trials and tribulations and struggles, my mom and dad were able to have a simple life, stay together, and keep our kids together, keep my brothers and sisters together. And then when I read this, that's not exactly the way it was for her, but she she accepted that, and she let it lead her life to be what she wanted it to be. And in spite of all of this, uh, growing up this way, no mom after 8. Same way with my dad. My grandmother died when he was very young. How did my grandpas go on? Yeah, did they
right.
struggle? You can be assured they struggled, you know. And
Right, right.
so eventually, when they ended up at Shilako, and actually due to some of the programs that Shilako had, that's what kind of led my mom to Wichita, because that's my dad was already there. He had left Shilako because he had had some training in aircraft. So he went to Wichita looking for work in the aircraft business. And then when my mom and some others, I think, including 2 of her sisters, they went to Wichita, and that's when my dad and mom hooked back up after meeting the first time. And then eventually they built a relationship and got married.
I love
But
that they met in school. That's so
yeah,
cute.
I think there's obviously a lot of young people that do, and my mom's a special person, just as most moms are, and they took advantage of some of the training and education that they had. They also, my mother was a good athlete. She played tennis and basketball. She even had the opportunity to maybe go to a college in Ark City, just across the border from Chilocco into Kansas, but she felt like I did. She didn't. she didn't think she could do college work, so
Oh,
she did,
yeah.
so she chose not to. But I think while she grew up in some difficult circumstances, as did my dad, they met and they made the best of it together. And while we still see a lot of our families, struggling, and I know when I was at Todd County, many of my kids were had single parent mothers. The mother was raising the kids, and of course, too, a lot of abuse. Not just abuse, physical abuse, but sexual abuse as well. I don't need to tell you about suicide. I could write a book on all the suicide that I've dealt with in my career as an educator. Suicide can be devastating. I think a lot of it, emotions and mental issues with kids that don't have the kind of help that they need. They don't have the kind of support, that they need. But I can tell you, in most places that I've ever been, that's one of the issues that I dealt with, unfortunately, on the bad side. I'll just share one, little story with you. I was at Flamingo Indian School, and I got a call from the mortuary. We had had an incident previously. A young man took his life. He took a towel and tore it into strips, and then the pipes were exposed in the bathroom, and he threw the towel, tied the towel around the pipes above him, and then he wrapped them around his neck, and then
Goodness.
he leaned on a chair that allowed him to fall off the chair, and then he hung himself. Unfortunately, it was on a night where, a lot of times we would show movies to the kids in the auditorium, and then after the auditorium movie was over, we would have a late meal, and so to kind of get them all back in the dorm.
Hmm.
And it was on that night that he did that. The real irony of it is that earlier in the day, he was a good athlete, and we had a track meet on the public school track, and I was down there, and Daniel won like 3, 4 medals because he was a good runner. So when the mortuary called me and said, "Wayne, can you come down? We're ready to ship Daniel home, and we need to have somebody to pick up his belongings and kind of look to make sure that everything is as it needs to be." And so I went down there, and they handed me a plastic bag that had whatever Daniel had on him. And one of the things that Daniel had on him was 4 of those medals that he won in that track meet.
No. Oh my
So
God, Wayne. Wow.
so uh,
Heartbreaking.
and that was one thing, but you had to go back to school on Monday, and all of a sudden your whole school culture is wrecked. The staff, the kids, the kids would not walk in the shower stalls, in the hallways. They see him at night. They hear him walking in the halls.
Aw.
Uh, the staff is blaming themselves. Those are hard occasions to deal with, and I've certainly
Mhm.
dealt with more than my share in my career. We took a cultural approach to it, and we invited a medicine man to come in, and we told the students that's what we were going to do. That he would come in, he would burn sage throughout the building, throughout the dorms. Anybody that wanted to smudge, he would make himself available at certain times for the kids to smudge. And it just took a while, you know, to kind of get things situated where, there wasn't so much alarm. And of course, the staff is a whole different thing. But I finally had to call them all in the library and say, look, we can't bring Daniel back. Suicide for many kids is the answer. That's the answer to their problems. That's not what they're
Mhm.
told, but to them, they think that's the answer. And I said, and Daniel solved his problems. And I said, now, while we feel bad about that, maybe we feel a little bit of responsibility. I said, we've got 450 other kids here that need our attention, and so
That's
we
right.
we need we need to stay focused. And that's the only time that I ever addressed the staff about it. And we just kind of moved on. But I've dealt more than my share of the death of students.
I bet you have. I mean, it's strange because it's nowhere near what you've probably seen simply because you were an educator in the native boarding schools for so many years. But for myself, I have a great amount of native friends on my social media, and there are a few of them that seems like every other week they're talking about a cousin or a friend or an uncle or whoever it is that another suicide. And sometimes it just gets so heavy on you, you just think about it and you're like, there's nothing, what can we do, what do we do? But definitely in the Native American community, the suicide rate is so high, and I don't know that a lot of people know that it really is a sad scenario. And obviously there's the thought of what's the word when you basically your trauma has been passed down through generations. And I believe that everyone can work through any kind of trauma, not that it's easy. I believe there is hope. I don't want us to always focus on the fact that some people feel helpless, and I hope that they will feel hope. But at the same time, knowing where that comes from, it could come from years and years of ancestors being abused, or even going back to the Trail of Tears. So it's an interesting theory and thought, and I tend to believe that it is true that historical trauma can be passed down.
There's no question about that. I mean, I think each of us in our own way live with it. We try to adapt and adjust to it, but sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not, which is to say, I think there will always be occasions when historical trauma of we as Native people, it doesn't necessarily have to say it happened to us, but it happened to our people, and so I don't know that that will necessarily be a circumstance that will be easily resolved in a world that refuses to accept the truth and much less even want to hear the truth. And that's why I say it. That's why I read so much. Yeah, I'm not involved in Indian education or Indian issues much anymore, but I still thrive on having as much knowledge as I can about what history has been and why it's still relevant today in
Mm-hmm.
dealing with what we deal with.
Absolutely. Wow, it's pretty heavy stuff. And honestly, I wanted to share a little bit about Shiloko because I think a lot of people have heard of it but don't know much about it. It was a boarding school that focused on agriculture and was open from 1884 to 1980, just outside of Newkirk, Oklahoma, which was close to the Kansas border. Shiloko means big deer or horse in the Muscogee language. In reading accounts from students, some stories were positive and some negative. Some students had bad situations at home, and the school provided a roof over their heads and meals to eat. On the other hand, others told of poor living conditions and malnutrition, typical of a lot of the native boarding schools at that time. I cover quite a bit of information on the boarding schools in various episodes. And as I mentioned before, understanding that the atrocities that occurred, need to be addressed and remembered. But today it's definitely a 180 from the old days, and something that happens now is students are taught their culture and traditions, and they're given a positive environment with caring instructors. So Wayne, tell us more about your family and your family history. Your parents were born in the 1920s, correct?
Yes, I think back then, and I think as you know, Indians didn't become citizens until 1924. Congress didn't create the law to make Indian citizens until 1924. And that always astounds me a little bit. because my mom and dad were born in 1921 and 1922. So when they were born, they weren't considered citizens of this country, even though at that time there wasn't a true process of identifying citizens of a tribe. That part didn't come till later. But, and when we talk about historical trauma, to me, that's part of it. When you're going through and my parents lived through a brief time where they weren't citizens. And what does that mean? They can't vote, or they can't do this, or they can't do that. But I think as far as my family, I guess what I would want people to know is that in spite of a lot of the adversity that our families experience, you know, that there's a responsibility of everybody in each family to do their part, and I think this is where a lot of our families break down. You know, we have this expectation that it's only the mom and the dad that provide. All those years, my mom and dad worked every day. They worked at aircraft business for worthless wages. You know, that's why my mom and dad thought so much about education. And I really feel like the decision that they made to push my brother and I towards going to high school was they wanted us to have a better life. At the same time, they wanted us to have a better life than they did. But, that's real harsh for me to say that, because I always thought growing up with my mom and dad, I had a good life. My mom and dad loved me. They provided. We had a roof over our head. We had transportation. We had food on the table. They couldn't always pay their bills, but you know what? We had some of the essential needs that people have to have.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, not everybody does have. So I think about that a lot. And the times of growing up, being a kid during those times when I'll just share a personal incident in my life that I remember one day my mom and dad had borrowed a car, and because they didn't have one. And we it was all four of us, my brother, my two sisters. I think I was around third grade, and we got in the car, and it was really all real quiet. And what we didn't know at that time until later was that our mom and dad were taking us to a children's home. And we stayed in that children's home for a year through the third grade. And we only saw our mom and dad when they could get transportation to come and see us at that children's home. And we did that for a year, so did I think that was tough? Yeah, I thought it was tough, but at the same time, it would be selfish of me to not think how tough it was for my mom and dad to do that, in their efforts to make a life for themselves after moving to Wichita. This is what they were faced with, trying to have a life and still have that life. I mean, they came to Wichita by themselves. Now here they had four kids to deal with. And so I realize now how tough that might have been for my mom and dad to do that, to leave us in that children's home for a year. But, I guess it was what was best. I think things got a little better after that. They both ended up having jobs and getting jobs, and then, being able to rent a house or have a place of our own. So it wasn't so bad after all, I guess. my brother and I, we still laugh and think about that. But, even now, maybe we find a little humor with it, but back then, maybe it wasn't so humorous. But, again, it's just one of those things that I think families struggle with. It's one of the things that we struggled with. And I think eventually, things got better and, we ended up with transportation and a house. And I think about, too, what a culmination that was for my mom and my dad, leaving their homeland to come to Wichita and a whole different world, the discrimination and racism, and they survived. They persisted, and so I think in me, I think sometimes that's the least I can do is to show because of them I am who I am. And when we would talk about education that my mom and dad wanted for us, my oldest brother has a master's degree from Penn State. I have a doctor's degree from the University of Missouri. My sister has a bachelor's degree from Newman in Wichita. And my other sister has a bachelor's degree from Shawnee. I think that's in some small way, how we've honored our mom and dad for the sacrifices that they had in their life to give us a life. So
God bless them.
And now my dad's been gone for a long time. My mom lived for a long time after that. She was 99 when she
Wow.
passed, and my dad was 62. So he died
Yeah.
way before his time. So
He sure did. He sure did.
But you know what though, Rachel? When I talk about Haskell, I mean, I played football and I played tennis, and my brother played basketball. And when we had games, Wichita is about 2.5 hours on the interstate from Wichita. You know what? Every chance my mom and dad got after work, they would come up to Lawrence to watch us play.
Are you serious? Wow. And that's so
So,
special.
so Haskell, not only for us as me and my brother and my sister, but it was something for my mom and my dad,
Yeah, so proud, right?
to show their support and in what we were doing. And that's why I always say Haskell was, one of the great experiences in my life. And that's part of it because of what it meant for my mom and dad too. So really, really a very special time and a special experience in the life of the Johnson family.
Right, right. I know that some of these subjects have been really hard to talk about. And by the way, you've soldiered through very well, but it's so inspiring. I mean, your words are positive. The fact that your family didn't have much and they struggled, but they loved you guys and they wanted the best for you. And hear you again in the story of the note in the counselor's folder, and you didn't let that stop you. You needed a little prodding, which we all do. I mean, that's a word for all of us too. Don't forget to encourage people to, reach higher and do what they're meant to do. And everybody deserves a chance. So these are so inspiring, even to me. So I hope our listeners will enjoy it too.
Yeah. Well, and to kind of close out the family part of it, I had 4 sons and a daughter. My daughter has 2 children, Wrigley and Kennedy. Matter of fact, Kennedy is going to be enrolled at the University of Kansas, and matter of fact, they're bringing her down here next week. So
yeah,
that's exciting, So she's leaving South Dakota to come to University of Kansas in Lawrence. And I have 4 sons. My daughter's name is Heather, Elaine, Elizabeth, and those are the 2 names of her grandmothers.
oh,
And
beautiful.
yeah, and so Then my oldest boy is Aaron, then Jeremy, Cody, and Nathan. And then on Bernita's side, she has a daughter, Beth, and two sons, Michael and David, and so Beth has two children, Brooke and Braden. So we've just been blessed with our children and grandchildren, and the tough part about it is they all live up north, South Dakota and Minnesota.
Oh, I'm sending hellos to them. Hello to all the children of Bernita and Wayne. I hope many blessings are on your families.
Yeah, thank you for that. I talked to my son today. One of them, he lives here in Kansas City, he and his girlfriend. And so I told him I was going to do this podcast with you. He said, "Oh, that's really cool, Dad." He said, I said, "I'll let you know, when it hits the media." He said, "Okay, do that." So I wanted to make sure I got their names in there and things. So, we're really proud of our kids, and
of course,
like I said, we just don't see enough of them, but we're happy that they're happy, and they're doing their best to have the kind of life that they want. My daughter is a teacher at Flanders Indian School. I remember telling her one time, I said, "Heather, whatever you do, don't be a teacher."
She obviously didn't take Dad's advice.
Yeah, you can see how much she listens to me.
Yeah, but at the same time, that really must say a lot. She probably really admired what you did in life and wanted to be just like you. So what a compliment, eh?
Yeah, it is really. Actually, it is. So, but like I say, Bernita's a long-time educator. She also worked at Flanders Indian School, and she's probably I have to say, she is the reason that I have a doctor's degree. And,
wow, tell us about that.
We first got together. Well, actually, we'd been together for a long time before Kansas City. And when I moved here, she was teaching at doing some adjunct work for the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and also in Fargo. And at the time, all I had was a master's degree. So she talked me into enrolling at UMKC in their ed specialist degree program. So I did. And I ended up with an ed specialist degree, which is the next degree above a master's degree. And then I stumbled across a program that was a doctoral program. And she said, you need to call about that. So I called, and somehow I got in. She kept me on pace with the book work, and then of course the writing of the comps, and then of course the dissertation. So, when you have that kind of support, that kind of help, it's hard to go wrong. So I can remember we had one bedroom just set up for my area to write in. All my literature was everywhere, my laptop. And I'd be sitting there watching TV, and she'd say, "Don't you think you should be in there writing?" So
get on in there, get to writing.
There I go. And the funny part about that, Rachel, is that I could write at different times, but sometimes I would be up there just literally in the middle of the night, and sometimes that's when I would do my best writing. And then there's other times you could sit down, I couldn't write my name. And that's just the struggles of what you go through, and you've got a big document to write. And I think it ended up like 220 pages. So
wow, that's quite an achievement. I know I couldn't do that without my eyes going cross at least.
Mine went crossed. I'm still waiting for them to uncross.
No. Is that what happened? No, just kidding. Wayne's eyes are not crossed, just for our listeners. But
I first saw you on the screen, I saw two of you.
Uh,
but that's, kind of my family. We, like I say, when Bernita and I visit a lot, we talk about family. We talk about, what it was like for her parents because she's Danish, and we share a lot of Indian issues, and so
mm-hmm,
it's always good to to talk on the same level with with people because they know and understand what it's like, and so
mm-hmm.
uh, Renita taught at Flandre Indian School as well. So
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned kind of a funny story though about Heather and a doctoral student who had asked her about some native authors, right?
yeah, we were up visiting one time, and she said, "Dad, I got to tell you something." She said, "You're just not going to believe this." She said, "There's a guy at Northern State University in Aberdeen, South Dakota. He was looking for somebody to tell him about where he could find certain resources because he was working on his dissertation. Somehow he got my name and he called me, and he just called out of the clear blue because uh, Heather's enrolled as a Santee Sioux, and so she's tribal, and that's when he contacted, he asked her about, you know could she help him find some resources on Indian education, and he said, right now the only thing I have is a dissertation on educational leadership by a Dr. Wayne Johnson. she, she
Say
said,
what?
she said, I about lost it. She said, that's my dad.
I love that. That is so great.
Yeah,
And
that
you're
was
like, yeah, your dad's kind of a big deal. So now you know. And I know you won't brag on yourself, so I'll do it for you. You've been published in articles, especially in Indian education. You've walked the halls of Congress and spoken to a lot of other Congress people about education. You were also tribal assembly president and an educational counselor appointed by the governor. When you were Secretary of Education, you even worked on the executive board for the Johnson O'Malley program. The Johnson O'Malley program, tell us a little bit more about that.
it was authorized early on, and it really surfaced because of how the federal government was dealing with Native kids. And as you know, when they create a bill for Congress to pass, every politician is jumping on board to add their bill onto a particular bill, that they know is going to pass.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Johnson O'Malley bill is reauthorized, by Congress yearly, and that's really how the Johnson O'Malley Act started. And again, as I told you, a lot of the Indian kids left the reservation to go to public schools. And so there were probably, instead of the boarding schools and reservation schools, there were probably as many kids in public schools across the country. And so the Johnson O'Malley bill helped, fund the education and provide needed tutoring and services to Indian kids in schools. But, not only on reservation schools, but off reservation schools, and so it's a good bill, and the way the money is determined for that bill is by the counting of American Indian kids. Well, for many years, yeah, we counted the Indian kids, but the money that we got for each kid stayed the same, and
Mm-hmm.
that needed to be fixed. And so one of the things that I'm really pleased with, because I served on the National Johnson O'Malley Board, was to lobby Congress. And of course, we had one of the best lobbyists in the country. Boy, we just walked the halls of Congress and talked to any congressman that would listen to us. At the same time, we scheduled special congressmen that had concerns with Native Americans. So while we didn't talk to everybody, we talked to the ones that primarily showed a strength in Indian education. And, lo and behold, we got the amount increased per student, and we came up with a better process of counting the kids, because it's not every public school had a Johnson O'Malley program, but they had Indian kids. So how do you count them? So we helped to generate a new law and a new bill, to accommodate this program. So in leaving, when I retired, that was a feather in my cap.
Very proud of you, by the way.
Thank you.
I'm so glad you find pride in that too, because something that we all value and probably isn't, our educators probably are not thanked enough. So thank you for all of that. So it's the work of people like yourself that truly are, actionable in a meaningful way to our Native youth. You've done so much there. And yet when you and I were last talking, you literally said to me, none of that compares to when I was a teacher. I love that.
Yeah, when I first went to Haskell, of course, I went there because the coach asked me, and and my attitude was simply about sports, participating in sports and going early to practice football and stuff. And when school started, we actually had to go to class. I got to thinking, I better figure out why I'm here, and eventually that's what I decided, that I wanted to be a teacher and a coach. And I think once I made that decision, I think that's kind of what carried me through, because I knew the courses that I would have to take. And of course, Haskell at that time was just a 2-year school. So I would have to graduate with my AA degree and go to a 4-year school to finish and do my student teaching. And so, that's what I did. Matter of fact, when it came for me to do my student teaching, I wanted to be in a school where there was a population of Indian kids. I had to drive a long way to do it, but I did. So that's kind of what got me started, going to an Indian school, working as a student teacher with Indian kids. And then, like I indicated earlier, before I could graduate from Baker, I was offered a job at Flandreau Indian School. So I took it. And I certainly, while it was a crossroads for me, I never really looked back. I went to Flandreau, and whatever Flandreau Indian School gave me and led me to, that's what I did. Flandreau led me to Riverside, and Riverside led me to Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge led me back to Flandreau, and Flandreau led me to Rosebud with some stops, in between. And then, of course, I retired working for my tribe. Mm-hmm. But I have to say that it all started with my desire to be a teacher.
And, that's your legacy, and it's a noble, very noble legacy. So I'd like to leave our listeners with an interesting story, in addition to the other interesting stories we've been hearing, about your connection with Billy Mills, or William Mervyn Mills. He's an Oglala Lakota whose name is Tamakoche Tehila. He shows up at the Tokyo Olympics in 1964 and was basically a no-name, completely unknown, and he totally crushed the 10,000 meter run, winning a gold medal. He even beat the world record holder. Today, he's still known as one of the biggest upsets in Olympic history because of his being so unknown prior to the event. Tell us about your story of Billy Mills.
I could tell you a lot of stories about Billy. I think the key thing, I think the first time I ever met Billy was when I was at Haskell, and he was coming down from South Dakota, and he was with the athletic director from Flandreau Indian School. I did not know him at the time, but he and Billy were good friends, and one day they showed up at Haskell, and well, I found out later that Billy was going to speak at the Federal Pen in Leavenworth, and he was going to speak to a Native American culture group. And lo and behold, I was invited to go with Billy and my friend to the prison to hear Billy speak. So we all met at the prison at a certain time because you had to go in at a certain time, and you had to empty everything out of your pockets, and they open a door, you go in, they close it behind you, then they open the other door, and they kind of tell you, don't look at the prisoners, just follow the guards. They're going to take you to the room. And so that's what we did. It was really just awesome because to see these Native prisoners come in and be a part of this culture group that they have. I still think about that a lot. Billy got up to speak, and before he speaks, he always shows the finish of that 10,000 meter run in the Tokyo Olympics. He came to Flandre Indian School, and I introduced him, and that's what we showed it. And I can tell you, every time I watch that, I just get chills. It's just so awesome. But the other thing about Billy is that he is the only American to ever win the 10,000 meter run.
Amazing.
The only American. And a lot of people will never understand how much of an upset that it was for Billy to win that race, because he did, in fact, beat the world record holder, who was supposed to be a shoo-in to win the race. Billy was a nobody. He wasn't even supposed to be in the race, but he was never given a chance. And so for him to win, and in the fashion that he did, was just, he showed that video to the prisoners and it's so cute. They just stood up and clapped.
That's so awesome.
That was, I tell you, talk about put a lump in your throat.
Well, I mean, when you talk about this, it right, like you said, it's a goosebumps moment, because I think about so many of these natives that probably were in that prison for whatever crime or whatever had happened at that point in their lives. And we all know that there is a history of a lot of challenges in our community. And so for them to look at a hero like this that just crushed it and was Native American and represented, their same ethnicity, I'm sure it just must have been really, really cool for them to have that to look up to.
Oh, it was just awesome. And of course, I've had so many occasions to listen to Billy talk and just be around him, and he afterwards, the president of the organization, he handed out certificates to all of us, certificates of appreciation to all of us that were there. And I just cherish that certificate. I've been given a lot of recognition things and certificates in my career. And I have to tell you, that's one of the ones that I value the most, is that certificate that shows that I was part of this meeting. And
cool.
So yeah, that it just made my day. When I think about Haskell, this is one of the true experiences that I remember, that I love sharing.
And you even mentioned, like, the Olympics are going on right now as we are recording this. So you mentioned that he would be going to Tokyo, or maybe he's already there, and he'd go with his wife. And that must be something really incredible to be back where he won in 1964, right?
For sure. Native Americans have a legacy in Japan, and certainly Billy is part of that. And I think that was one of the reasons why he and Pat went back to Tokyo this year, was they had created a statue, that they were going to honor Billy with. So they had the opportunity to go back. I don't know if you saw it, but on one of the nights of the night of the 10,000 meter run, during the run, they honored Billy during the run.
Cool. I missed that. Are you serious?
Yeah, they showed a replay of that run. So be prepared to get a lump in your throat. So.
I know. I've already had a bunch of them tonight. Goodness. Time for
You know,
more, I guess.
the guys that are doing the commentary on the race, it's getting down to the end, and Billy is not close. And
Wow.
all of a sudden, they're calling it like one of these other runners is going to get the victory. And one of the background commentary guys says, all of a sudden, he says, and here comes Mills. And then this one guy just blurts out, look at Mills, look at Mills. You have to see it.
Wow. Wow.
It's so spectacular.
So spectacular. I love
it's
it so much.
it's awesome. So I'm Facebook friends with Billy, and we see whenever we can. A lot of times, Pat and Billy will come back to Lawrence for something, and and we'll run into them. And so over the years since Haskell, I've seen Billy on so many. He came to Pine Ridge a lot of times, and and I've seen him at different events. Other big meetings like National Congress of American Indians or whatever. So.
Mm-hmm. So, Wayne, are there any words of wisdom you'd like to impart upon myself and our listeners before we close?
I guess the only words that I could think of that I think have helped me a lot is that, when you think about your life and the people that have been in it, the situations that you've been in, we always know that there's going to be good and bad. And unfortunately, we can't just call out the bad and only deal with the good. Unfortunately, life does not work that way. Mm-hmm. So in working with young people and the people that I've been around, I've always tried to say, know who you are and know how you got to be that person. Because if you don't, it's going to be real hard to move forward, and
Indeed.
And I think that's just what helped me as I went through a lot. I mean, nothing is easy for anybody. It certainly wasn't easy for me. But when you have so much to be thankful for, just understand and know how you got that, how you are in the situation that you're in, so you can find value in yourself and who you are, and will continue to move forward with that, facing any challenges that might be ahead of you.
I love that. This conversation has been such an inspiration to me, and I know it will be to our listeners as well. You were listed as not college material, and you went on to get your degree and master's degree and doctorate, and to write a 220-page dissertation, not to mention, oh yeah, you served our country in the Navy too. You then went on to improve education and help for Native American youth, and have done so much in the community. If you can do that, and if Billy Mills, who was a Native that no one knew, can win an Olympic medal, people, we can do anything. Please feel empowered today to do what it is that you're called to do. Yakoki Wayne for being here with me today.
Mado Rachel.
God bless.
Right here at Chickasha Wings, we teach people to fly. We've got 11 airplanes, 9 flight instructors, and about 5 mechanics. We turn out about 80 new certificates or ratings each year. And we train pilots who now fly at the major airlines. They fly for the Air Force, the FAA, for private jets. We even have a few missionary pilots. Our customers come from all over the United States. Here at Chickasha, we're able to provide lower costs, a more focused training program, and we're able to provide a higher level of customer service. My favorite thing about this business is helping people, because I see people go from not knowing anything about it to being an airline pilot. Come out here and learn to fly.
Thanks for listening to Native Chalk Talk. Be sure to join our community on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Simply search for Native Chalk Talk. That's Native, CHOCTALK. And check us out at nativechalktalk.com. Stay tuned for the next episode. You're going to love it. Yakoki. Thank you, my friends.